They claimed godlike power, but Earth's war machine shattered their reign. The transformation of Earth happened faster than anyone thought possible. Within 2 weeks of Protocol Ragnarok's activation, the Sol system looked completely different. Orbital factories that once built passenger ships now produced destroyers and cruisers. Asteroid mining stations worked around the clock, their entire output feeding the hungry war machine. The space above Earth glowed with the light of 1,000 welding torches as new warships took shape in the void. Admiral Hyuk walked through the command center, watching the progress report scroll across dozens of screens. Production numbers that should have taken months were being achieved in days. Humanity was showing what it could do when survival was on the line. But numbers alone would not win this war. The Valorians had technology that seemed like magic. Their ships could phase through solid matter. Their weapons could tear apart the very fabric of space. How did you fight an enemy like that? The answer came from an unexpected place. 3 weeks into the war, a Valorian fleet arrived at Kepler 442, a colony world with 2 million inhabitants. They expected an easy victory. They got something else entirely. Hyuk had positioned 300 human warships in orbit around Kepler. The Valorian fleet numbered only 30 ships, but each one was massive and powerful. By all logical calculations, the humans should have been obliterated in minutes. The Valorians thought the same thing. They opened fire with weapons that bent space itself, creating gravity wells that crushed human ships like tin cans. But Hyuk had studied the destruction of Proxima Station. He had analyzed every scrap of data, and he had realized something important. The Valorian weapons were incredibly powerful, but they took time to recharge. In those few seconds between shots, they were vulnerable. The human fleet did not fight like the Valorians expected. Instead of trying to match their firepower directly, Hyuk unleashed thousands of missiles and autonomous drones. Simple weapons by Valorian standards, but there were so many of them that the alien point defense systems could not track them all. While the Valorians focused on the missiles, human railguns opened fire. Solid metal slugs, accelerated to a fraction of light speed, slammed into Valorian shields at a rate of hundreds per second. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, 2 Valorian dreadnoughts had been destroyed, their golden hulls torn open and leaking atmosphere. The remaining Valorian ships retreated, something they had not done in living memory. The humans had lost nearly 200 ships and 60,000 crew members, but they had proven something vital. The Valorians could be hurt. Dr. Minji stood in her laboratory, staring at pieces of wreckage recovered from one of the destroyed Valorian ships. Her team had been working without sleep for 3 days, taking apart the alien technology piece by piece. What they found was both encouraging and terrifying. The Valorian technology was based on quantum field manipulation. They could change the fundamental properties of space and energy using devices that were far beyond human understanding. But here was the key thing Minji discovered. All of their systems operated on the same base frequency. They were all connected, all synchronized. It made their technology incredibly efficient. It also made it vulnerable. If we can create interference on that frequency, Minji explained to Admiral Hyuk via secure video link, we can disrupt their entire system. Shields, weapons, engines, everything runs on the same quantum field. Disrupt the field, and they lose everything at once. Hyuk leaned forward, his scarred face showing the first sign of hope in weeks. How long until you can weaponize this? Minji looked at her exhausted team, then back at the camera. Give me 2 weeks. I'll give you a weapon that can kill gods. While Minji worked on her resonance disruptor, Captain Doyen and his Void Strikers were learning to fight Valorians up close. They had infiltrated several Valorian-occupied systems using captured phase shift technology. It barely worked, and half the time it killed the user instead of teleporting them. But when it did work, it let human soldiers appear where the Valorians never expected them. Doyen led a mission to sabotage a Valorian communication relay on the edge of the Deneb system. His team of 12 strikers phased into the station's maintenance section, armed with weapons designed for close-quarters combat. What they found waiting for them changed everything humanity thought about their enemy. The Valorian guards were not ready for a fight. They had been the dominant species for so long that they had forgotten what real combat felt like. They relied on their energy manipulation powers, expecting to simply obliterate any threat with a gesture. But the Void Strikers did not fight fair. They used smoke grenades, flashbangs, and rapid-fire weapons that gave the Valorians no time to focus their powers. The battle was brutal and short. Doyen personally killed 3 Valorian guards, watching their glowing eyes dim as they died. Gods did not bleed golden blood. They bled red, just like humans. He planted antimatter charges in the relay's power core and extracted his team. The explosion destroyed the relay and cut off Valorian communications across 3 systems, but the mission's real value was the intelligence they gathered. Doyen had recorded everything, and the analyst back on Earth made a shocking discovery. The Valorians were not as unified as they appeared. There were factions, disagreements, even hints of internal conflict. The empire that claimed to be eternal was starting to show cracks. 2 weeks later, Dr. Minji delivered on her promise. The resonance disruptor was ugly, barely tested, and had a 30% chance of catastrophic failure. But when it worked, it was beautiful in its destructiveness. The first field test took place during a Valorian raid on the Tau Ceti system. 50 Valorian ships entered the system, expecting to find minimal resistance. Instead, they found Admiral Hayuk waiting with 400 human warships. The Valorians opened fire, their reality-warping weapons tearing through the first wave of human defenders. Then Minji activated the disruptors. The effect was instant and devastating. Across the battlefield, Valorian shields simply vanished. Their weapons stopped firing. Their ships began tumbling out of control as their engines failed. The Valorians found themselves suddenly mortal, suddenly vulnerable, suddenly terrified. The human fleet did not hesitate. Railguns, missiles, and energy weapons poured fire into the disabled Valorian vessels. In less than an hour, 30 Valorian ships were destroyed. The remaining 20 fled in complete disorder, abandoning their mission and running for their lives. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Hayuk watched the enemy retreat and allowed himself a grim smile. For 10,000 years, the Valorians had been the predators of the galaxy. Now for the first time they were prey. News of the Battle of Tau Ceti spread across both human and Valorian space. For humanity, it was proof that victory was possible. Recruitment centers were flooded with volunteers. Ship production doubled, then doubled again. The war machine that had seemed like desperation a month ago now looked like the instrument of victory. For the Valorians, the news brought something they had not felt in millennia: fear. Their Senate convened emergency sessions. How were these primitive humans defeating their superior technology? Some senators called for negotiation. Others demanded overwhelming force. But all of them felt the same creeping doubt. What if they were wrong? What if they were not invincible? High Executor Talron stood before the Senate, his golden face showing emotions his species had nearly forgotten. Anger, frustration, and underneath it all, the first hint of worry. He had given the order to destroy Proxima Station, expecting humanity to collapse in terror. Instead, they had declared total war and were somehow winning. "We will crush them," Talron declared to the Senate. "We will show them the true power of the Valorian Empire. We will make them understand their place in the cosmic order." But even as he spoke the words, Talron wondered if he still believed them. The humans fought with a ferocity that made no sense. They accepted losses that would have destroyed any other species' will to fight. They adapted to every tactic, learned from every defeat, and came back stronger each time. The Senate voted to escalate. More ships would be sent. More worlds would be targeted. The humans would be taught their lesson through overwhelming force. Talron left the Senate chamber with orders to break humanity once and for all. But as he walked through the golden halls of Valoria Prime, he could not shake one troubling thought. The humans had only been fighting for 6 weeks. What would they be capable of in 6 months? They claimed godlike power, but Earth's war machine shattered their reign. Admiral Hyuk stood before the holographic display showing the Gamma Serpentis system. For 3,000 years, the Valorians had held this system as one of their most important strongholds. It was home to shipyards, supply depots, and a fortress that had never fallen in battle. Now Hayuk was going to change that. The operation was called Prometheus, and it was humanity's first major offensive into Valorian territory. The fleet assembling in the Outer Sol system was the largest humanity had ever built. 4,000 warships of every size and class, from small corvettes to massive dreadnoughts, 500,000 autonomous combat drones, 12 prototype Titan-class siege platforms, each one carrying enough firepower to level a city, and on every ship, human crews ready to prove that their species would not bow to anyone. President Yoonji had given the final authorization 3 days ago. The message she sent with the fleet was simple. Show them what happens when they threaten Earth. The journey to Gamma Serpentis took 2 weeks at maximum speed. Huck used that time to drill his fleet relentlessly. Every captain knew their role. Every crew practiced their assigned tasks until they could do them in their sleep. This would be the biggest battle in human history, and there would be no room for mistakes. Dr. Minji traveled with the fleet aboard the flagship Soul's Pride. She had spent the last month improving her resonance disruptors, making them more powerful and more reliable. The new models had a 90% success rate and their range had tripled. She had also developed a new weapon called a quantum cascade bomb. It was incredibly dangerous, barely tested, and could potentially tear a hole in space if something went wrong. But if it worked, it could crack the Gamma Serpentis fortress like an egg. Captain Doyen and his Void Strikers were aboard assault carriers, ready for boarding actions. They had been training for urban combat in zero gravity, practicing with new weapons designed specifically for fighting Valorians at close range. Doyen had personally overseen the development of armor-piercing rounds that could punch through Valorian personal shields. His troops called them God Killers. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Gamma Serpentis system. Immediately, alarms began screaming. The Valorians had been waiting. Their defensive fleet numbered 800 ships, positioned in perfect formation around the fortress. It should have been an overwhelming advantage. The Valorians still thought in terms of quality over quantity. They were about to learn a harsh lesson. Admiral Hayek gave the order, and the human fleet split into 20 separate strike groups. They did not advance in formation like the Valorians expected. Instead, they swarmed from every direction at once, using tactics that made no sense to an enemy who had fought the same way for thousands of years. The Valorians opened fire, their reality-warping weapons reaching out across the void. Human ships began exploding, torn apart by forces that broke the laws of physics. In the first 10 minutes, humanity lost 200 vessels. But for every ship destroyed, 4 more took its place. The human fleet kept coming like a tide of metal and fury. Then Dr. Minji activated the resonance disruptors. The effect rippled across the battlefield as disruption fields spread from ship to ship. Valorian shields flickered and failed. Their weapons went silent. Their perfect formation began to break apart as ships lost power and tumbled into each other. The human fleet hit them like a hammer. Railguns fired solid slugs that punched through golden hulls. Missiles streaked across the void by the thousands, overwhelming point defenses through sheer numbers. Energy weapons, crude by Valorian standards but brutally effective, carved through disabled ships. The space around Gamma Serpentis became a killing field. The battle raged for 16 hours without pause. Admiral Hayek fought from the bridge of Soul's Pride, coordinating strike groups and rotating damaged ships to the rear. He had learned early in his career that the key to winning was not avoiding casualties but managing them. Keep fresh ships at the front, pull damaged ones back to repair, and never stop pressing the attack. It was brutal mathematics, but it worked. The Valorian fortress itself was a construct that dwarfed anything humanity had built. 10 kilometers across, protected by shields that could withstand a supernova, armed with weapons that could destroy planets. It had never fallen because it had never been seriously attacked. The Valorians had assumed its very existence was enough to deter enemies. They were wrong. Yuck ordered the Titan-class siege platforms forward. These massive ships moved slowly, protected by screens of smaller vessels, bristling with weapons designed for one purpose: breaking fortresses. They took up positions around the fortress and opened fire. The combined firepower was enough to light up the entire system. But the fortress shields held. Dr. Minji watched from Soul's Pride as her calculations played out in real time. The fortress shields were incredibly strong, but they had one weakness. They were designed to absorb massive single impacts, not sustained pressure from multiple points. Keep hitting them from different angles, and eventually, they would fail. For 6 hours, the Titan platforms pounded the fortress while the rest of the human fleet held off Valorian reinforcements. The shields began to flicker. Small sections failed and were quickly restored. But each failure lasted a bit longer. The Valorians inside the fortress realized with growing horror that their impregnable defense was cracking. Captain Doyen watched the shields fail from his assault carrier and knew it was time. All strikers prepare for insertion. This is what we trained for. The shields failed completely at hour 18 of the battle. For 30 seconds, the fortress was vulnerable. In those 30 seconds, 300 assault pods launched from the human fleet, each carrying a squad of void strikers. They slammed into the fortress hull and burned through with cutting torches. Captain Doyen was in the first pod through. The interior of the fortress was like nothing humans had ever seen. Corridors wide enough to drive trucks through, walls that glowed with soft golden light, gravity that shifted based on which direction you walked. But it was still just a building, and buildings could be taken by determined troops with guns. The Void Strikers moved fast, splitting into teams and pushing deep into the fortress. They encountered Valorian guards who had never fought inside their own stronghold before. The close-quarters battle was savage. Valorian warriors used their energy manipulation powers to throw strikers through walls, or burn them alive with focused plasma. But humans had learned to counter these tactics. They used smoke and flashbangs to break Valorian concentration. They moved in teams, never giving the enemy time to focus their powers. And when Valorians died, they died just like anyone else. Doyen led his team toward the fortress core, where the main power generators and command center were located. They fought through 4 levels of defenders, leaving dead Valorians and humans both behind them. By the time they reached the core, Doyen had lost 40 of his 300 strikers. The survivors were covered in burns and wounds, running low on ammunition, but still moving forward. The fortress command center was a vast chamber with holographic displays showing the disaster unfolding outside. Valorian commanders watched helplessly as their defensive fleet was torn apart by human numbers and determination. They barely had time to turn before Doyen's team burst through the doors. The battle in the command center lasted 3 minutes. When it ended, every Valorian commander was dead, and Doyen stood over their bodies, breathing hard. He activated his communicator. "Admiral, the core is ours. Recommend immediate withdrawal. We're planting charges." Admiral Hyuk did not hesitate. "All fleet units, pull back to minimum safe distance. Strikers, you have 5 minutes to evacuate." Doyen and his teams ran through the corridors carrying wounded and leaving antimatter charges behind them. They reached their assault pods with seconds to spare. As the last pod cleared the fortress hull, the charges detonated. The explosion was visible from 3 light-years away. The Gamma Serpentis fortress, which had stood for 3,000 years, tore itself apart from within. The shockwave destroyed another 50 Valorian ships that had been too close. The remaining Valorian forces fled in complete disorder. On the bridge of Soul's Pride, Admiral Hyuk watched the fortress die and felt no joy, only grim satisfaction. They had won, but the cost had been terrible. 1,500 human ships destroyed, over 300,000 crew members dead. The Void Strikers had lost 90 troops taking the fortress, but Gamma Serpentis had fallen, and the message was clear. Nowhere in the Valorian Empire was safe anymore. News of the battle reached Valoria Prime within hours. The Senate erupted in chaos. Some members called for immediate peace negotiations. Others demanded that the entire human species be exterminated before they became an even greater threat. High Executor Talrin found himself removed from command, replaced by War Master Kelvin, a hardliner who had argued from the beginning that humanity should have been destroyed on sight. Kelvin's first order as War Master sent shockwaves through both empires. He authorized the deployment of the Starbreaker, the Valorian Empire's ultimate weapon. It was a mobile platform the size of a small moon, capable of inducing stellar collapse. They claimed godlike power, but Earth's war machine shattered their reign. The massive ships appeared above Earth without warning. They were bigger than mountains, their golden hulls shining with light that seemed to come from within. The ships did not follow the normal laws of physics. They simply appeared in orbit, as if reality itself had opened a door and let them through. Admiral Hyuk stood in the command center of Earth's orbital defense network, staring at the screens in disbelief. He had fought in wars across 3 star systems. He had seen humanity's best technology and most powerful weapons. But nothing in his 40 years of service had prepared him for this. The sensors could barely understand what they were looking at. The energy readings made no sense. These ships were impossible. "Sir, they're broadcasting on all frequencies," said a young officer, her voice shaking. Hyuk nodded slowly. "Put it on screen." The face that appeared was almost human, but not quite. The being stood 3 meters tall with skin that glowed softly like warm gold. His eyes were like stars, burning with light that hurt to look at directly. He wore robes that seemed to shift color between deep purple and midnight blue. When he spoke, his voice carried power that made the speakers crackle. People of Earth, I am Talrin, High Executor of the Valorian Empire. For 10,000 years we have brought order to the chaos of the galaxy. We have lifted primitive species into enlightenment. We have ended wars and brought peace to 1,000,000 worlds. Now we extend this gift to you. Hyuk felt his jaw tighten. He knew that tone. It was the voice of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. Talrin continued, his glowing eyes seeming to look directly through the camera and into every human watching. You will dismantle 90% of your military forces. You will surrender control of all colony worlds to Valorian administration. You will accept our guidance in all matters of governance, technology, and expansion. In return, we will allow your species to continue existing under the Pax Valoria, the eternal peace we have established across the stars. The High Executor paused, and his expression hardened. This is not a negotiation. This is not a request. This is the natural order of the universe. We are to you as you are to insects. Accept your place or be removed from existence. You have one standard week to decide. The transmission ended. For a moment, the command center was silent. Then every screen erupted with information as governments, military commanders, and civilian leaders across Earth began shouting for answers, demanding action or simply panicking. Hyuk turned to his second-in-command. Get me President Yunji, now. 3 days later, the United Earth Assembly gathered in emergency session. Representatives from every nation and every colony world filled the Great Hall in Geneva. President Yunji stood at the podium, a small woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war. She had been elected on a promise of peace. Now she faced a choice that could doom her species. Dr. Minji sat in the observer's gallery, watching the debate rage below. She was the chief scientist of the Quantum Warfare Division, one of Earth's most classified military research programs. She had lost her entire research team 3 years ago in an experiment gone wrong. The memory still haunted her dreams. Now she watched as politicians argued about whether humanity should bow to these aliens or fight. Some representatives argued for submission. The Valorians were clearly far beyond human technology. Fighting would be suicide. Better to accept their terms and hope for mercy. Others argued for defiance, saying that freedom was worth any price. The debate went in circles for hours. Finally, President Yunji raised her hand for silence. The hall quieted. She stood there for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. Then she spoke in a clear, steady voice. I have read the histories of our species. I have studied every war, every conquest, every empire that has ever risen and fallen on Earth. And I have learned one thing above all else. When someone comes to your home and demands you kneel, there is only one answer that lets you keep your soul. She paused, looking around at every face in the assembly. We did not crawl out of Earth's gravity well, survive our own extinction attempts, and build an empire among the stars just to kneel before self-proclaimed gods. Our answer is no. The assembly erupted. Some cheered. Some shouted in protest. Some simply sat in shocked silence. But the decision was made. The Valorian response came swiftly. Proxima Station, humanity's oldest and largest colony beyond the Sol system, simply vanished. One moment it was there, home to 3 million people. The next moment, there was only empty space and a slowly expanding cloud of exotic radiation. The Valorians had not just destroyed the station, they had erased it so completely that not a single atom remained intact. Admiral Hyuk watched the readings from the destruction with cold fury. 3 million people, gone in an instant. He had friends on Proxima Station, had, past tense. Now there was nothing left to even bury. He activated the command console with steady hands. All stations, this is Admiral Hyuk. Authorization code Ragnarok Alpha 1. Execute Protocol Ragnarok. Total War mobilization begins now. Across the Sol system, the response was immediate. Every civilian shipyard converted to military production. Every factory retooled to produce weapons, armor, ships. Every mining station redirected its output to the war effort. Humanity had not fought a total war in over a century, but the machinery was still there waiting. Now it roared to life. In her laboratory deep beneath the Swiss Alps, Dr. Minji received new orders. Every experimental weapon, every theoretical technology, every dangerous idea that had been deemed too risky or too unstable was now greenlit for immediate development. She looked at her team, seeing the same determination in their eyes that she felt in her heart. They would arm humanity's fist with the most terrible weapons science could create. Captain Doyen received his orders in a training facility on Mars. He commanded the Void Strikers, the most elite special operations unit humanity had ever produced. His soldiers were enhanced with cybernetics, trained in zero-gravity combat, and ready for missions that regular troops could not survive. Now they had a new enemy to study, an enemy that thought itself invincible. Doyen gathered his troops in the briefing room. 300 of the deadliest soldiers humanity had ever produced looked back at him. He kept his briefing simple. They think they're gods. They think we're insects. They're wrong on both counts. We're going to teach them what happens when you threaten humanity's home. We're going to show them that gods can bleed. The Void Strikers roared their approval. The war had begun, and humanity would fight with everything it had. The Valorians had made a fatal mistake. They had given humanity a week to prepare. They would soon learn that a week was more than enough time for humans to sharpen their knives. They claimed godlike power, but Earth's war machine shattered their reign. The news reached Earth before the surviving ships did. The Starbreaker was destroyed. Sol was saved. 400 billion people would live. But the cost had been 48,000 crew members and the best heroes humanity had ever produced. President Yunji stood before the cameras with tears running down her face as she read the names of those who had died. Captain Doyen, Dr. Minji, and so many others who had given everything so that humanity might survive. The memorial service was held in Geneva, broadcast to every human world. Billions watched as President Yunji spoke about sacrifice and courage. She talked about the people who had looked death in the face and kept moving forward. She made sure everyone knew the names of those who had saved them. And then she made a declaration that echoed across human space. The Valorians came to us claiming to be gods. They demanded we kneel. They killed 3 million of our people when we refused. They tried to murder our entire species when we fought back. Now they will learn what happens when you threaten humanity's home. We will not stop. We will not forgive. We will not rest until the Valorian threat is eliminated forever. Admiral Hyuk, now promoted to Supreme Commander of all human military forces, stood beside the president. He had aged 10 years in the 6 months since the war began. His face was covered in scars and his eyes had seen too much death. But his voice was steady when he spoke. Captain Doyen told me once that gods can bleed. He was right. We proved it at Gamma Serpentis. We proved it at the Starbreaker. Now we're going to prove it all the way to Valoria Prime. The human war machine, already massive, grew even larger. Every world contributed. Every factory ran at full capacity. The production numbers were staggering. 10,000 new warships per month. Millions of tons of ammunition. Weapons that Dr. Minji had designed before her death, now being mass-produced by teams of scientists continuing her work. Humanity was showing what a species could do when survival was on the line, and vengeance was in their hearts. But something else was happening too. News of the Starbreaker's destruction spread through Valorian space and beyond. Species that had served the Valorian Empire for thousands of years began to question. If humans could destroy the ultimate weapon, could kill War Master Kelvin himself, then maybe the Valorians were not invincible after all. Maybe they were just another species that had gotten lucky and stayed on top for a long time. Rebellions erupted across the Empire. Worlds that had been subjugated for millennia saw their chance and took it. The Valorian military, stretched thin trying to fight humanity, could not suppress all the uprisings. The empire that had stood for 10,000 years began to crack. On Valoria Prime, the Senate descended into chaos. Some members called for immediate peace with humanity. Others insisted on total war, arguing that any sign of weakness would destroy what remained of their authority. The debates went in circles while human fleets advanced deeper into Valorian territory. Admiral Hyuk launched Operation Avalanche 6 months after the Starbreaker's destruction. It was humanity's largest offensive yet, aimed at the heart of Valorian space. 5,000 warships advanced in multiple strike groups, hitting targets across 100 systems simultaneously. They used every tactic that had worked before. Overwhelming numbers, resonance disruptors, unpredictable movement, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The Valorian defenses, designed for a different kind of warfare, could not adapt fast enough. System after system fell to human forces. Worlds that had never seen combat in thousands of years suddenly had human warships in orbit. The advance was not clean or easy. Humans died by the millions in the grinding campaigns, but they kept coming, wave after wave, replacing losses faster than the Valorians could inflict them. The siege of Valoria Prime began 1 year after the war started. Admiral Hyuk brought 8,000 warships to orbit around the Valorian homeworld. The planet was protected by orbital fortresses that made Gamma Serpentis look small, defended by fleets that numbered in the thousands. It was the most heavily defended world in the known galaxy. The battle lasted 3 months. It was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a slow, grinding campaign of attrition. Human forces attacked relentlessly, accepting terrible losses to destroy defensive positions one by one. They used captured Valorian technology against its makers, threw resources at the problem that the Valorians could not match, and simply refused to quit no matter how bad it got. President Unji watched the casualty reports come in and felt sick. Over 2 million human soldiers had died taking Valoria Prime's orbital defenses. But she did not stop the offensive. Could not stop it. The Valorians had to understand that threatening humanity came with a price that could not be avoided or bargained away. When the last orbital fortress fell, Admiral Hyuk did something unprecedented. He sent a message to the Valorian Senate offering terms for peace. Not the peace the Valorians had demanded at the war's beginning. This was victor's peace, dictated by the side holding the knife to the loser's throat. The terms were harsh. The Valorian Empire would be dissolved. All military forces would be disbanded. Valorian worlds would become independent states, supervised by human peacekeepers for 100 years. Every species the Valorians had subjugated would be freed, and the Valorians would pay reparations for the damage they had caused. The Valorian Senate met in their golden chamber, watching through the windows as human warships filled the sky above their capital city. The debate was short. Some senators argued for resistance to the end, but most looked at the facts and understood. They had lost. The species they had dismissed as primitives had defeated them through sheer determination and industrial might. The Senate voted to accept the terms. The Valorian Empire, which had ruled for 10,000 years, ended not with grand battles but with a vote in a chamber full of defeated leaders. The formal surrender happened 2 weeks later. Admiral Hyuk stood in the same Senate chamber where Valorian leaders had once commanded fleets that dominated entire spiral arms. He looked at the senators, these beings who had thought themselves gods, and saw only tired, frightened people who had finally learned they were mortal. "You could have had peace," Hyuk said quietly. "We would have traded with you, learned from you, maybe even become friends. But you came to our home and demanded we kneel. You killed 3 million of our people to make a point. You tried to exterminate our entire species. Now the galaxy will know what happens when you threaten humanity. Remember this lesson well." 5 years after first contact, humanity emerged as the dominant power in their region of space. The species that had once trembled before Valorian might now sought human protection and alliance. Earth became the center of a new order, one built not on claims of superiority but on the simple understanding that humanity would protect its friends and destroy its enemies with equal determination. The memorial in Geneva grew to cover 50 acres. 42 million names were etched in black stone, representing every human who had died in the war. At the center, raised higher than all the others, were the names of Captain Doyen and Dr. Minji. Their sacrifice had saved not just Earth but shown the galaxy that humanity would rather die than submit. Admiral Hyuk, now an old man covered in scars from a dozen battles, stood before the memorial on the war's 5th anniversary. Behind him, Earth's orbital shipyards continued their work, building not weapons of war but ships of exploration and trade. The war was over. Humanity had won, but the cost would be remembered forever. He saluted the memorial as he did every year on this day. Then he spoke softly, knowing that no one could hear but needing to say the words anyway. "You claim to be gods. You claim to be invincible. You claim to be eternal. You were wrong on all counts, because you made one fatal mistake. You threatened humanity's home. And there is nothing in this universe more dangerous than a human with something to protect." He stood there for a long moment, remembering the faces of those who had not returned. Then he turned and walked away. Behind him, the memorial stood eternal, a reminder to the galaxy of what humanity had done and what it would do again if necessary. In the archives of a dozen civilizations, a message was spreading. It was passed from species to species, a warning to any who might consider threatening the humans. The message was simple. They are not the strongest. They are not the fastest. They are not the most advanced, but they are the most relentless. They do not know how to quit. They do not understand surrender. And when you threaten their home, they become death itself. The Valorians learned this. They claimed godlike power. Earth's war machine shattered their reign. Remember this and choose peace. The message spread across the stars and the galaxy learned a new truth. Humanity had arrived and the age of easy conquest was over. Any species that wanted war with humans could have it. But they would get all the war they could handle and more. Because humanity had proven one thing beyond doubt. They would rather die standing than live kneeling. And that made them more dangerous than any species that had ever claimed to be gods. The Valorians had thought they were dealing with primitives. They had been wrong. They claimed godlike power, but Earth's war machine shattered their reign. The human fleet called Ragnarok's Fang launched from Mars orbit with every fast ship humanity could spare. 300 vessels chosen not for firepower but for speed. Their mission was simple and terrible. Intercept the Starbreaker before it reached Sol or die trying. Every crew member knew they were not coming home. They went anyway. Admiral Hayek commanded from the destroyer Heaven's Fury, a ship built for speed and equipped with the latest resonance disruptors. Dr. Minji had converted an entire cargo bay into a laboratory, working on weapons even as they traveled. Captain Doyen and his Void Strikers were spread across multiple assault carriers, ready for whatever suicide mission came next. Behind them, Earth began evacuating as many people as possible to the outer colonies, but everyone knew it was hopeless. If the Starbreaker reached Sol, humanity's home would die. The Starbreaker was a construct beyond human comprehension. The size of a small moon, it looked like a massive sphere of dark metal covered in geometric patterns that hurt the eye to look at directly. At its core was a device that could manipulate gravity on a stellar scale, forcing a star to collapse in on itself. War Master Kelvin commanded from its bridge, protected by 500 Valorian warships and the Empire's most elite warriors. He was confident. Nothing could stop this weapon, certainly not the primitive humans. The human fleet caught up to the Starbreaker 4 weeks into its journey to Sol. They had pushed their engines past safety limits, burning out systems and sacrificing speed for acceleration. When they dropped out of faster-than-light travel, they found themselves facing the full might of Valorian defensive forces. Admiral Hyuk did not waste words. All ships engage. Remember, we only need to slow them down long enough to get a strike team inside that thing. For Earth, the response echoed across every ship. For Earth, the battle began immediately. Valorian ships opened fire with their reality-bending weapons and human vessels started dying. But the humans had learned how to fight Valorians over months of brutal warfare. They swarmed, using numbers and unpredictable movement patterns. They focused fire on single targets, overwhelming shields through sheer volume of attacks. And they kept coming no matter how many died. The running battle became a nightmare that lasted for weeks. Both fleets were moving at high speed toward Sol, fighting constantly. There were no breaks, no pauses for repair or rest. Damaged ships fell behind and were left to die. Fresh crews rotated to weapon stations as exhausted ones collapsed. It was warfare at its most brutal, a grinding contest of attrition where every hour cost lives. Dr. Minji worked in her laboratory while explosions rocked Heaven's Fury around her. She had spent the last month developing her ultimate weapon, the Quantum Cascade Warhead. It was based on a theory that had gotten 3 of her researchers killed in testing. The weapon would create a cascading collapse in quantum fields, spreading destruction like a chain reaction. If placed at the Starbreaker's core, it should tear the entire construct apart from the inside. The problem was getting it to the core, and the fact that whoever delivered it would not survive the detonation. 3 weeks into the running battle, the human fleet had been reduced to 150 ships, but they had destroyed over 300 Valorian vessels through tactics that bordered on suicidal. Admiral Hyuk rotated damaged ships to the rear constantly, keeping the most combat-ready vessels at the front. He slept in 4-hour shifts and spent the rest of his time coordinating attacks. His officers begged him to rest more, but he refused. Every decision mattered. Every mistake cost lives. Captain Doyen spent those weeks preparing his strikers for the boarding action. They all knew it was a one-way mission. They spent their time writing letters to families they would never see again, checking equipment one last time, and making peace with death. Doyen was proud of them. Not one person asked to be transferred out. They were warriors who had chosen to stand between Earth and destruction, knowing the cost. On week 4, the human fleet made its final push. Admiral Hugh gathered every remaining ship for one massive assault. They would punch through the Valorian defensive line or die trying. There was no retreat, no backup plan. Just forward, always forward. The attack was devastating for both sides. Human ships threw themselves at Valorian defenses with complete disregard for safety. Destroyers rammed dreadnoughts. Frigates used their own bodies as shields for larger vessels. Dr. Minji's disruptors created chaos in Valorian formations. For 30 brutal minutes, the space between the fleets became nothing but fire and death. When it was over, only 60 human ships remained operational. But they had done it. A corridor had been opened to the Starbreaker itself, a path that would stay clear for perhaps 10 minutes before Valorian reinforcements closed it. It was enough. Captain Doyen led 300 Void Strikers in assault pods toward the Starbreaker. They used experimental phase shift pods that were barely functional and might kill them before they even reached their target. Half the pods failed during transit, their occupants dying in the void or scattered across space in pieces, but 150 strikers made it through, burning holes in the Starbreaker's hull with cutting torches and forcing their way inside. Dr. Minji went with them, carrying the Quantum Cascade warhead personally. It was the size of a large backpack, heavy even in zero gravity and incredibly unstable. One hard impact might set it off prematurely. She moved carefully, following Doyen's team deeper into the Starbreaker. The interior was vast beyond imagining. Corridors stretched for kilometers. Chambers the size of stadiums held machinery that pulsed with incomprehensible power, and everywhere Valorian elite guards waited. These were not regular soldiers. They were warriors who had trained for centuries, enhanced with the best technology the Empire could provide. They could manipulate gravity to crush enemies, generate plasma hot enough to melt armor, and move with speed that seemed impossible for beings their size. The battle through the Starbreaker was the most savage combat humans had ever experienced. The Void Strikers fought through kilometers of corridors, leaving blood and bodies behind them. Human and Valorian alike fell as the two forces clashed with desperate fury. Doyen's troops used every trick they had learned. Smoke grenades to break Valorian concentration, rapid fire to keep them from focusing their powers, and sheer determination that refused to acknowledge the impossible. By the time they reached the command bridge, only 13 strikers remained alive, including Doyen. Dr. Minji was still with them. Her left arm burned away by a Valorian plasma blast, but still clutching the warhead with her right hand. They stood before the massive doors to the bridge, knowing what waited inside. War Master Kelvin stood in the center of the bridge, surrounded by his personal guard. The Valorian leader was the most powerful warrior his species had produced in 1,000 years. He radiated energy that made the air shimmer, and his eyes burned with fury at the insects that had dared invade his ultimate weapon. "You cannot stop this," Kelvin said, his voice like thunder. "Your son will die. Your species will be erased. You are nothing before the power of gods." Captain Doyen checked his weapon and looked at his remaining troops. They were wounded, exhausted, running on nothing but will. He looked back at Kelvin and smiled. "Then let's kill some gods." The final battle erupted. Kelvin alone was powerful enough to fight all 13 humans at once. He killed 4 strikers in the first 10 seconds, his energy blasts atomizing them before they could react. But humans did not fight fair. They scattered, attacking from multiple angles, using the bridge's equipment as cover. Doyen emptied his weapon into Kelvin's chest while 2 strikers detonated explosive charges at point-blank range, sacrificing themselves to wound the War Master. Kelvin fell, disbelief in his eyes. He had lived for over 800 years. He had conquered star systems and broken species beneath his heel. And now he was dying, killed by creatures he had considered little better than animals. His last thought was one of recognition. These humans were not weak. They were something far more dangerous. They were determined. With the command deck secured, Dr. Minji activated the Quantum Cascade warhead. The device came to life with a hum that seemed to resonate in her bones. A timer appeared, 5 minutes. Not nearly enough time to escape even if there had been a way out. Doyen gathered his 5 surviving strikers. They looked at each other, warriors who had faced death 1,000 times and finally found it. There was no fear in their eyes, only acceptance. They had saved Earth. That was enough. Admiral Hyuk, watching from Heaven's fury, ordered all remaining ships to retreat to minimum safe distance. He wanted to stay. to be closer to the people who had given everything, but his duty was to witness to make sure their sacrifice was remembered. The quantum cascade warhead detonated exactly 5 minutes after activation. The explosion was not like normal weapons. It created a localized collapse in the quantum field, spreading through the Starbreaker's systems like a disease. The massive construct began tearing itself apart from the inside out. Its own power turned against it. The final explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. A brief new star that announced the death of the weapon that would have killed Earth.